Good afternoon and a warm welcome, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to host today's event organized by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger and greener. The Chinese Communist Party is due to celebrate its centenary this July, and we will be publishing a new paper tomorrow by Dr. Holly Snape from the University of Glasgow entitled The Chinese Communist Party at 100, Adaptable and Abiding. This paper looks at the direction Xi Jinping is taking the CCP and what it means for the future. But today we have a fantastic opportunity to discuss the CCP centenary with our esteemed panel. The CCP has lived through different periods and was led by numerous leaders who also led with different levels of severity. However, since 2012, its current leader, Xi Jinping, has imposed a greater level of control over the CCP. He is taking over the party and its government, which in turn signals a decisive break from its past. So what is the future of the CCP and what risks it might pose to the stability of the geopolitical order in the upcoming years and decades? We will hear answers to these questions and more from Tom Tugendhat, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, member of the House of Commons and our Advisory Council member, Lord Ricketts, former National Security Advisor and member of the House of Lords, and our two Associate Fellows and experts, Charles Parton and Dr. John Hemmings. Tom Tugendhat is a member of Parliament for Tonbridge and Morling, and before entering politics, he was Lieutenant Colonel in the British Army. After leaving the British Army, he worked on the Army strategy team, helping prepare for the 2015 Strategic Defence and Security Review, and also served as military assistant and principal advisor to the Chief of the Defence Staff. In 2017, he was elected as the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and in 2020, he co-founded the China Research Group, and he is also a leading thinker in Parliament on relations between the UK and the People's Republic of China. Our second panelist is Lord Peter Ricketts, who is a former National Security Advisor and member of the House of Lords. Lord Ricketts had an illustrious career as a British civil servant and diplomat. He served for 4 years as Permanent Secretary to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and then was appointed as the first ever UK National Security Advisor. He also served as UK Ambassador to France from 2012 to 2016, before being appointed a member of the House of Lords. I'm also delighted to present Charles Parton, who is our Associate Fellow at the Council on Geostrategy and one of the top experts on China in the UK. He spent 22 years of his 37-year diplomatic career working in and on China, Hong Kong and Taiwan. In 2017, he was chosen as the Foreign Affairs Select Committee's Special Advisor on China, and he returned to Beijing for 4 months as advisor to the British Embassy to cover the Communist Party's 19th Congress. And finally, we are joined by Dr. John Hemmings, who is our Associate Fellow at the Council on Geostrategy. Dr. John Hemmings worked for several think tanks and held a number of visiting fellowships. He has briefed several British government departments and parliamentary committees, including the Ministry of Defence, Department for International Trade, and the Cabinet Office. Dr. John Hemmings holds PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Master's degree in International Peace and Security from King's College London. So a couple of housekeeping rules before we start our discussion today. Our panelists will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and in the second half of the hour, we will have our Q&A session with the audience. Mr. Tugendhat will start with his speech first, followed by Charles Parton, Lord Ricketts, and Dr. Hemmings. Finally, you can ask questions, but please do make sure to indicate your name, your affiliation, and to whom you are addressing your question during the course of the whole event. Mr. Tugendhat, unfortunately, will have to leave a bit earlier because he has a speech to give at the Parliament later this afternoon. So without any further delay, Mr. Tugendhat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. I should correct one thing. I don't know why people say it, but I didn't leave the army and then join the army strategy team. I did that as a serving officer. That was part of my duties. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be with you here online. I thought I'd cover 3 points, if I may, briefly before we clearly open it up to questions. And I would like to make it absolutely clear that these are not the only points that I think are relevant. There's just 3 points that I think are partly relevant today. The first is gender. A slightly odd thing to say in a panel that's entirely men, but there we go. The first is gender. The second is economics. And the third is ambition. And you may say that these are not really separate policies. They are actually all 3 connected, all 3 separate items. They're all 3 connected, but I just thought I'd cover them quickly. And then hand over to other illustrious speakers who will now, no doubt, extract much, much better information. The first, though, is gender. Look, we are dealing currently with a Chinese society that is massively over-maled. Not just panels in the UK, but also entire societies can find themselves in a position where misogyny really does shape the outcome of the debate, and nowhere more so than China today. Now, on one level, you may say, what does it matter? After all, societies survive with imbalances for a long time. That's true, but societies with imbalances that are largely male tend to have specific problems and specific issues that lead to rises in violence, greater amounts of instability, higher crime rates, and so on. That's a challenge. If people aren't going to be able to marry, if people aren't going to be able to settle, if that has implications for people's old age care or social networks, that's a challenge. Now, the second one I was going to raise was economics. We know that Chairman Xi has abandoned his 6% target for GDP growth. Now, everybody knows the figures were largely fictional anyway, but the very fact that he's abandoned it suggests there may be a deeper malaise in the economic system of the Chinese Communist Party, or rather of the Chinese Communist Party is trying to run than initially appears. Now, that's where it comes into what I'd call ambition. There is something about religious movements, and I don't know, forgive me, I speak as a theology graduate here, but there is something about religious movements that they inherently try to limit the ambitions of their adherents so that they know that they are bound by God and the heavens. And there is something about the Chinese Communist Party that exists within that firmament as well. And here we see things like Jack Ma and the Ant Group, or indeed other ambitious leaders in the business sector being challenged by the party, or rather being told by the party that there is none superior under God. This is a challenge, because we are now in an information age, as everybody knows, where ideas and opportunities emerge quickly, change fast, and need to be grabbed. If individuals are dissuaded from ambition, are persuaded that innovation, or rather growth and size, are put you in the firing line rather than put you in the reward line, that does change the way people interact, not only with the state, but with each other. So I think those 3 things pose for me what I think are 3 fundamental issues that the Chinese state has to deal with. And at the moment, I think is dealing with, well, is finding it very difficult to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Tugendhat. Mr. Parton, over to you.
Thank you. Well, here we are 100 years and we're sort of looking forward to the next 100 years. And I won't go into the successes of the Communist Party, which are quite considerable, but look at the second centenary goal, which is what Xi Jinping declared, is also highly important, namely, in effect, building a superpower, what he says, a modern socialist country that's prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious. And I think what's been the strength of the Communist Party so far is it's been its ability to adapt and be flexible, whether that's through Deng's economic reforms or Jiang Zemin bringing private enterprise and business into the party, etc. So it's that flexibility and adaptability that served it so well. And I think that under Xi Jinping and in the future, that has been lost, and that will be, to me, the reason why in the next 5 to 10 years we're likely to see peak China. The party's been pretty successful in some areas of reform. In fact, there are 4 major areas of reform. The party itself, which was started in 2012, you got the economic reforms of 2013, the reform of law in 2014, and the reform of the military in 2015. And certainly, in terms of what the party has done in positioning itself and regulating itself and strengthening itself, you have to give it a tick there. Corruption and discipline is much improved, and the central control of the party. So looked at from Xi's point of view, I think that would be a success. And ditto with the rule of law. I mean, we concentrate very much on things like the way dissidents and human rights and other things are treated. But if you look at the aim of the reform of rule of law, which was to improve business and finance and the trust in that, to make the judiciary more professional, because it had just been stopped by a load of old retired army officers, some of which can be very effective, as we know, Tom, but others aren't necessarily when it comes to something as technical as the law. But it's, the law has improved in things like the environment, in intellectual property and business and increased trust. So that has to be ticked. And the military, again, is becoming much more professional, and it's certainly much more under the control of the party, which to Xi Jinping would count as a big success. But I think you have to look most importantly at the 2013 reforms of the economy, because a strong power, a superpower, Xi Jinping's ambition for the mid-century requires a very strong economy to sustain it. And what was very clear back in 2013, in fact, even before, because in 2007, Premier Wen Jiabao talked about the 4 uns, i.e. that the Chinese economic model was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. Xi Jinping repeated that in 2013 when he announced the reforms, missing out unstable, because that's probably a statement too far. But in other words, the China model had gone up a cul-de-sac and needed to find another way out. Otherwise, trouble was on the horizon. And the challenges are immense. Tom has alluded to some. It's not just the demographics and the debt and the falling productivity, which people are familiar with, but I would put the water scarcity in the northern provinces, where 50% of the agriculture, population, industry resides, as probably one of the most serious ones, plus a very undereducated population. Only 30% of Chinese workforce has finished secondary education. And no country has made the transition from a middle income country to a high income country with less than 60% of its workforce at that level. So, and what's clear that over the last 7 or 8 years is that the party has tried a lot of reforms, in some cases not even tried, some quite easy ones, and failed. So, I mean, some easy reforms, moving the retirement age back, not happened. It happened in the UK without too much difficulty. A property tax, if you're looking at the sort of fiscal financial reform, that's surely, in theory, a relatively easy thing to implement, unless, of course, the problem being, of course, that party members would have to explain where all their wealth had come from. SOE reform, we're still hearing about it in the same terms as we were 8 years ago. Or the massive problem of how local government, which has 80% of the responsibility for expenditure, but only 50% of the income, how that balance is going to be established. And that was a deadline of 2016, and here we are 5 years later. And I think this is admitted by the Chinese themselves. I have a book on my desk from a think tank of the NDRC, the main economic planning ministry, super ministry, which is entitled The Phenomenon of Reform Instruction in China. It's a very candid book, which I don't think would be produced now, 4 years later. The reason I think for this is the failure to reform is fear and fragility. Contrary to propaganda, the Communist Party is, I think, very lacking in confidence. It is popular at the moment, but that popularity could disappear very quickly if the economic prosperity, which is the main prop for legitimacy, were to fall away. And any regime that puts more into its domestic surveillance and repression than it does into its military, that has an enormous censorship army, you have to say that it's probably not very confident in itself. And so I think that behind that, the ultimate reason is actually the inadequacy of the Leninist model itself. I think the limits of flexibility and adaptability have been reached. You cannot continue to govern by top-down instruction and inspection. You need allies like the private sector business, which supplies most of the tax and the employment and the innovation. You need a free press, you need civil society, you need independent law. And the party cannot, by definition, allow that, because that would give rise to alternate centres of power, which could become a threat. And as Kevin Rudd, the ex-Prime Minister of Australia, always says, staying in power is the party's number 1, number 2, and number 3 priority. So I'll end, I've probably gone on too long, by quoting from Zhao Ziyang, ex-Premier Zhao Ziyang, who spent the last years after Tiananmen in '89, thereafter in captivity. And he wrote a secret memoir. And towards the end of it, he writes as follows: if a country wants to modernize to realize a modern market economy, it must practice parliamentary democracy as its political system. And then a bit later, he says it would require a long but determined transition, during which permitting the existence of other political parties and a free press would be essential. So there you have Zhao on one side and the Xi Jinping model on the other. Zhao Ziyang knew an awful lot about reform and the Chinese Communist Party. I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years which of the two was correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parton. And Lord Ricketts, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Victoria. Well, I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I was very struck by a comment in the James King article in the FT at the weekend, the long read on China, where he said that China has an economic model which Milton Friedman would recognize, and a political model based on Lenin. And I think the question that Charlie raises there quite rightly is that sustainable in the long term? I've been not an expert on China, but I've been going to China since I went there for the signing of the Joint Declaration in 1984 with Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe. And I think it's too soon to conclude that we were wrong to decide that economic reform would in time unlock political reform in China for the kind of reasons that Charlie's just given. And the two presidents who preceded Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, were both much more pragmatic about incorporating China into the world economy in order to strengthen China. And it's Xi Jinping who has operated this abrupt change since 2012-13. And I agree with Charlie, this is a regime based on paranoia and insecurity. Paranoia about Western influence in all its varieties, and the risk of giving their own people any say, any opportunity in making choices for the future. And insecurity, because at the end, they are a small and mostly corrupt elite sitting on top of 1.4 billion people. And that's a very precarious position. And in my experience, the elite in China has always worried about unrest, particularly in the countryside. And when an issue like the environment or air quality, water quality cuts through and becomes an issue of unrest in the countryside, then the regime changes policy pretty fast. So change is possible, and I think it's wrong to assume that the growth of Chinese power, economic, political, military, will be linear. It will be an upwardly rising graph for all time. And indeed, I think Xi Jinping has baked in now a period of instability in the future by abandoning term limits, by interrupting that very careful model that Deng Xiaoping put in place of preparing a future generation of leadership and testing out a number of people in a range of jobs so that successions would be smooth. Having ditched that, then Xi Jinping has guaranteed that there will be a sclerotic end of regime at some point, and then a possibly disruptive transition of power. So I think we need to keep working to engage with this China, which is powerful, at the moment unpredictable, but deeply insecure. And I think it's good to see, for example, that John Kerry is back in harness with his Chinese counterpart as he was before the COP conference in Paris in 2015 to prepare the one in Glasgow this year. Just very briefly on a couple of foreign policy implications, I think we are absolutely right to focus on the security and the technology threat from China. I was really glad to see NATO picked up that challenge and said more about China in its communique a couple of weeks ago than it's ever said. NATO, after all, faces China increasingly in its backyard. And there was one point a few years ago when there were more Chinese warships in the Mediterranean than French warships. So it's right that NATO should look on China as a security adversary, potentially, and right that we should develop our own technology and security policies. And Tom and others are quite right to be speaking out bravely, as they have done, about human rights in China, in Hong Kong, in Xi Jinping, in Xinjiang, and so on. But we've also got to preserve this right capacity to work with China commercially, on economics, on investment, and also on the global goods like climate change. And I was glad to see that President Biden signed up to that dual track policy on China at the G7 summit. I don't think it's going to be easy to walk that tightrope. I think there will be tensions between European countries, including Britain and Washington, as we get that balance right. And I do hope that, although it's very difficult for this current government to work with the EU on any foreign policy issue, I do hope they can make that one of the priorities, because I think actually we have the same basic set of interests on China as other European countries do. Thanks, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Lord Ricketts. And Dr. John Hemmings, over to you.
Well, thank you, Victoria, for inviting me to be on such an esteemed panel. I said yes, absolutely, because of my support for what Council Geostrategy is doing. And then you mentioned the names, and I thought, well, why not? I will vigorously agree with everyone who's come before me and just try to maybe strike a slightly provocative tone for the coming discussion. I, at heart, agree with what Lord Ricketts has said, that we have to work with China on these other issues. People who know my writing and my tweeting probably know that I'm a bit more on the skeptical side and on the new Cold War side. Why is that? Am I embracing the old binary, global dilemma? I don't want to be, but I look at the party. I look at Xi Jinping's style of rule, and I think it's going to be very challenging for us to work closely with China on some of those global common issues. So why is that? Why am I striking that tone? Well, Xi Jinping himself says that what China has is socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's socialism, not any other ism. He's been, I think, over his rule since 2013 began, he's been very, he's had two messages, one message for the internal audience and the other for the external audience. And the internal audience has been told that, the party rule is everything, that has affected China's media and the freedom of various dissenting voices. It's affected Hong Kong very directly. It's affected the Uyghur. It's also, socialism. Xi Jinping thought has also influenced a soft cult of personality. I'm not going to say it's a full-on Stalinist Maoist version, but there is, apps on Xi Jinping thought and how his particular brand of socialism, which I accept is not the 1930s Soviet ideology. But I do think it's similar enough to have certain implications downstream. I think it definitely has a Chinese nationalism element to it because of he's pragmatic, and they have to deal with what's come before, and they have essentially harnessed Chinese history, particularly the humiliation narrative, to enable certain responses and framings for their foreign policy. You'll see that with how they frame the G7, the Quad. These are all pseudo-colonial forces that are going to stop them. And that mindset, in some ways they are responsive. You can see the backing down from the wolf warrior discourse. But on the other hand, their immediate approach is to harness I guess in a sense, the way that Marxist parties use historical relativism, the usage of social discourse, the political discourse, the United Front, the way that they are responding to the tensions with the United States, to me, are so much reminiscent of the way Leninist parties do, that I'm very worried about the future. There's no signs of that pragmatism that we saw under Hu Jintao or under Deng Xiaoping, under Xi. Xi is a believer. And as to Tom Tugendhat's point, in one of the early speeches he gave to the cadre, as Carew, the great theorist on communist theory, says, there's deep signs of religious fervor in Xi Jinping's approach to its Marxist heritage, including a kind of fervent belief in the ultimate victory of socialism over capitalism. These are in speeches that have slowly leaked out to us. How else does it feed into how China thinks and behaves internally, and how will that impact us on the outside? The digitalization of the economy, the data technologies, which are going to revolutionize how states and their governed people interact. We already see the historical materialism and the way that they are approaching digitalization. They are saying this is a shift, one of the great shifts in technology that will create a new paradigm. This is classic kind of dialectical thinking. And for them, their embrace of all those technologies like 5G ICT, which I am always fascinated by, have shown their deep interest in utilizing these technologies for what they call e-governance, or basically having total control of data over the society, and how that gets exported into the world, those standards, those systems, the ideology embedded in those technological principles are deeply worrying for people who are favor liberal democracies. So I guess my question would, three questions as I'm thinking about the future is less so much about whether we're going to call it a Cold War or not, but will what China is trying to do work? In other words, this socialism with Chinese characteristics, will it be effective? I think they think so at present. Will it work in terms of what they're doing on the technology side internally and the way they're exporting that? Second question is, how will it impact global order? Obviously, we're already seeing in the US, as the liberal democratic leader, a ideological response, but we're also seeing the debate inside the West prompted by China's external messaging that this is not ideological. We're seeing the debate that this is a kind of Thucydides rise, a realism thing, but I don't think it's really just two states that want the top position. I think there's an ideological element, very deeply so. And the third question is, how will it impact wider Western interests? And that is, for example, the liberalism that's baked into the UN and the global human rights, for example, is a very classical one, but even just the rule of law and UNCLOS in the maritime system, which China is increasingly becoming a major holder of those powers. So I think I've talked enough, and I will be very happy to engage in the debate and discussion that follows thereafter. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Hemmings. And I would like to use this opportunity to ask one question myself. Well, if the demographic challenges Mr. Tugendhat and what Mr. Parton mentioned are likely to destabilize the country, would the CCP seek to export China's internal contradictions through foreign policy expansionism? Mr. Tugendhat.
Well, that of course is one of the key questions. I mean, it is the nature of states that have internal problems. You can look at Europe in the 11th, 12th century, if you like, and to see the survival of young men and the good harvests of the 1000s and 1100s, to see the growth of the male population in Europe as one of the triggers of the Crusades. Now, I'm not saying that there are direct parallels with China. There certainly aren't. I mean, apart from anything, there isn't a Messianic site just outside the country that people are, looking at. But it is certainly true that large groups of unmarried young men cause internal difficulties that governments in the past and in different systems and in different societies have used to conduct military action on their neighbors, or indeed to achieve violent ends.
Thank you, Mr. Parton.
Well, just to add that the problem I have, I mean, I can see the general what you're saying there, Tom, and the general principle, but the question, the specifics is, if you were Xi Jinping and you wanted somehow to distract through external actions, where would you go to distract? Well, the obvious example is Taiwan. But then, of course, you run up immediately against the question of the Americans and other people's reactions, including the European Union and the UK, because if you start to invade Taiwan, you're going to get yourself landed with sanctions, and all that means for employment in your own country. You're only going to worsen the situation. Furthermore, the nature of modern warfare is probably not involving that many humans these days. And certainly, if you want to take over Taiwan, you're probably best not to launch a conventional invasion, because there are only 13 beaches you can land on, and it's probably relatively easy to defend against that. You're going to use other ways. So I take the general point. I'm just not quite sure how in practice it would ever be practical.
Sorry, forgive me. I wasn't suggesting for a moment they would, but you see movements, large movements of people is one of the things that you see, and they don't have to be military. And you're seeing a large movement of people outside China into places like Pakistan, which has a very large community. You're seeing large movements of people into East Africa, and the consequences that go with it. This doesn't have to be militarized, as you correctly state, but there are different ways in which popular movements can have effects.
Thank you, Lord Ricketts.
Yeah, I don't see China as territorially expansionist in the way that Russia has been recently. The flashpoint is Taiwan, as you say, but that's about more than just territory. I think what they do want to do is push the Americans out of their part of Asia and establish themselves as the dominant power in large parts of the Indo-Pacific. And I'm not an expert on the military program in China, but a lot of the military equipment, I think, is designed to make life extremely dangerous for the Americans as a naval power in the Pacific. So that's the South China Sea policy as well. I think that's the risk, but I would expect confrontation in other ways than direct military conflict, honestly, with China as it flexes its muscles and shows the rest of the world that it's a power to be reckoned with in Asia. I mean, I don't think it's a Cold War, to come back to what John Hemmings was saying, because I mean, we are deeply, deeply intertwined economically in a way we simply weren't with the Soviet Union. Apple and General Motors and people are selling their products as fast as they can in China. So we need to find a new paradigm. I think borrowing the Cold War phraseology is unhelpful, actually, because it is a very different situation.
Thank you very much. And Dr. John Hemmings?
I'm quite intrigued by the Cold War phraseology. I don't know if it's helpful either. I suppose where it is helpful is that when we're dealing with very specific issues that are reflected in our current situation with China. So, for example, increasing party control over the Chinese economy is just a fact. You can see it in the CCP committees that have sprouted up from, I guess they were in the 700,000 now to 1.3 million parties that are being pushed into their technology companies. The fact that, Jack Ma has disappeared for essentially not towing the centralized approach that Xi is promoting. Yes, you can be a private capital, but it has to be in service of the party. The discourse power that they're using within the Western media, we saw this a couple of years ago when it was revealed how much they were funding US and Western newspapers because the United States government, by the way, I speak as a private individual, the US said, as foreign agents, you have to report your funding. And it was very high levels of funding. And so those tools that we worried about in the 1950s that were intrusive in our domestic systems, when Eisenhower and others talked about this kind of psychological battle, I think they still exist. United Front, the influencing of political parties abroad, all of those things that are somewhat subversive towards the liberal democracies are similar, and therefore the things that we're going to have to deal with using perhaps the tool set from the Cold War.
Yeah, if I could just rebound on that quickly, I quite agree that the old tools of subversion and disinformation are alive and well with the new techniques in the digital world, absolutely. But the Cold War was essentially competition for global dominance, ideological, but also in a military sense. The Soviet Union was trying to export its model, if necessary, with violent overthrows during the Cold War. I don't think the Chinese have that same ambition, but I do think they want to be a dominant power in quite a large slice of the Asian region. So there are many, many risks. You're quite right. Sorry.
And Victoria, just one last word on the ideology. I mean, that was a noticeable feature of the Cold War between Russia and the USSR. And China has always eschewed the fact that its model, etc., is it cannot be exported. But I think that that's changing. If you look at recent statements from the party, it's much more talk about the relevance of the China model to abroad. And of course, as John said, if once you start exporting some of the technologies in which this ideology is embedded, the whole surveillance business, then I think actually you are beginning to export ideology. So I think that's an area we need to keep a close eye on. It's going possibly the way it was some years earlier. But like Lord Ricketts, I don't like to use the word Cold War. I mean, I don't think there's a really good substitute for it yet. I've been using the words values war, but nothing quite has the punch of Cold War. If someone can come up with a phrase, then they will be greatly thanked.
May I come in on just the word Cold War? Because I don't think any of us like it, but I also think that's a product of Chinese, very brilliant Chinese messaging. If you look at, for example, the way they use the term containment, they have used the term containment proactively for a decade on most US policies in the Indo-Pacific. I can give you any number of examples, but even just visits from President Obama to the region were attempts to contain China. And what's really fascinating to me to look at the way they've used it as a term of art is that they've shifted the meaning from the original containment theory under Eisenhower, which was to contain Soviet expansionism, to mean to stop China's rise. And actually, the West doesn't want to stop China's rise. We don't want to stop your rise, but that's the definition that they've adapted rather than to stop expansionism. So no one would think stopping Chinese expansionism is a bad thing, but we do think, well, stopping the rise seems a bit unfair. But that's the way they've shifted the meaning. And so I do believe that the current debate on whether the term Cold War is useful or not, it's obviously a very emotional one. I'm not sure what I think of it. I still think, whatever we call it, many of the structural issues that come from the ideological competition and the way that the Marxist-Leninist Party, which is celebrating its 100th year birthday, are now being updated in this new digital age. And so in that sense, as Charlie was saying, if you look at what they're doing at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, with the new internet protocols, they're trying to push out state governance over data, which is extremely alarming and extremely conducive to the way authoritarian single-party states control the totalitarianism, the way they control the data of people in everyday life.
Thank you very much. We have some other questions in our Q&A section, but may I please remind everyone, when asking your question, please indicate your affiliation. Thank you. So we have a question from Michael West, who's a lecturer in public and international law at Hong Kong, University of Hong Kong. And he is saying that 2021 is the first of series of landmark anniversaries for the China Communist Party. Another is 2027, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army. The authorities in the US, Taiwan, Japan, and Australia appear to be taking quite seriously the prospect of the PLA attempting to unify Taiwan with mainland China, if necessary by force, before 2027. If the US-led hubs and spokes network of security alliances in East Asia were to unravel, arguably Japan, Korea, and the Philippines would become indefensible were China to eject America from the first island chain. In the event of an unprovoked attack on Taiwan, what role, if any, do you think the UK can and should play? Lord Ricketts.
Well, hypothetical questions are always risky ones. I personally don't rate the risk of outright conflict over Taiwan as high as our questioner does. He's probably much more expert than I am. I think the downsides for China would be spectacular of any attempt to take Taiwan by military force. If they did, I mean, let's be honest, the Americans would have to be in the lead of any response to it. Only the Americans can muster the military power and get there fast enough. I imagine that Britain would want to be part of a coalition if the Americans tried to put one together, but we would only be playing a very secondary role given the distances and given the relative military balance between Britain, America, and China. But I guess we would want to manifest ourselves on the American side of that potentially extremely dangerous crisis.
Thank you. Dr. Hemmings.
So just, I mean, I think that's a great question for Charlie and Lord Ricketts. What should Britain do would be of interest to me. All I can say is I've never seen it this bad in terms of the threat perceptions of practitioners of an actual conflict. I've been watching Taiwan for years and I've never seen people this serious about it. So.
Thank you. Mr. Parton.
Just a quick preliminary comment on 2027, that actually, although that is, centenaries are always a lot of noise is made about, but if you look what the party's actually said about the renewal, the reform and professionalization of the PLA, it doesn't expect it to be completed even by 2035, I think is what it's really saying. But as for the UK, what it could and can't do, and I think it's very much a question of making clear to the Chinese beforehand, and that means, in a sense now, that we greatly support the right of nearly 24 million people to decide their own future, and that if you do go ahead and through force, one way or t'other, and I agree with Lord Ricketts, I don't think it's likely to be through military force, but through other forms of coercion, please do expect the British government to put sanctions on, to join the United States. And one hopes the Europeans, although I think, while I agree with Lord Ricketts, we must work as closely as we can with Europe and set aside our Brexit hang-ups and theirs. Nevertheless, I hope that all of us can make it clear to the Chinese quietly, well in advance, that this is what will happen, and that they will realize that the consequences of that will be very bad for themselves in terms of unemployment and unrest within China. They'll make a hell of a noise about it probably, even if we try and do this quietly, and get very upset with us. But I think our ministers have to have the I'm not quite sure what the politically correct expression is, but should we say guts, to get that message across well in advance.
Thank you. Another question is from Marco Ginangeli, diplomatic editor, Sunday Express. May I know a bit more about why we are referring specifically to a 5-10 year time frame for the CCP to survive economically? Mr. Parton?
Well, I could wax very long and lyrical on subject, and Marco, you would probably then already have gone away and done something more sensible. To me, I don't think anybody's. There's been an awful lot of discussion about debt, and so I won't go into a great deal of detail on that. But along with that, the productivity of China has been dipping consistently, and ultimately debt has to be paid for in one form or other, and that is going to lead to a slower economic performance, which, given that China is in many ways like a bicycle, it needs to keep moving forward pretty fast. But I think the other areas are, and I won't also go into demographics because I think a lot of that has been aired in the papers, but two areas that I think really are important for people to focus on. Firstly, the water scarcity in China's northern provinces. This is a really, really serious problem. I mean, a few very obvious statistics: 28,000 rivers disappeared within 2 decades. You know, you cannot exist without water. It's vital for your agriculture. And I think one of the speakers alluded to China's food security problem, which is a massive preoccupation of the leadership. 62% of China's water is used on agriculture. Nearly 50% of China's agriculture comes from those northern provinces, which are really, really suffering. I can't, I could, but it would take some length to explain the depth of that. And that shifting water through the South-North water transfer and other transfer projects is simply not the long-term answer. It's got to be completely structural. Dealing with it, and whether the party is capable of that, whether any party would be capable of it, is a really interesting question. And the second thing that I think, you know, I say to people, if you want to read one book on China that's come out in the last 12 years, read Natalie Hell and Scott Rozelle on Invisible China, and the problem of children and education and an uneducated workforce, which China has largely, despite the very large number of graduates that it puts out. It is a big country and it's a big economy. And it's not just a question of the number of graduates, it's the number of skilled workers you need for a high-tech economy. So I won't go on in any detail, but please read it, because I think it really is one of the most persuasive books and worrying books. Because Scott Rozelle, like me, none of us want to see the collapse of China. That would be a disaster for all of us. We probably want to see a Goldilocks China, neither too hot, neither too cold. But that's going to be very difficult, even that, I suspect, to achieve.
Thank you. Another question is from Thomas CJ, who's Operations Advisor at Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. What is the West doing to counteract the CCP's efforts to instill their values in technologies such as AI, for example, in standard setting? Dr. Hemmings?
Well, I'm very fascinated by this topic, but I won't go on too long just for the sake of discussion. But the summit in Cornwall, the working group for investment screening was developed, which I think is a great first step in a very, very difficult idea. So obviously, if these technologies are becoming a way of exporting authoritarian standards, and if Chinese control over companies, Western companies, through proxies and through investment becomes a security issue, which it now seems to be, people agree generally, how do we maintain the liberal ethos within the future of these technologies? And one is to have a secure supply chain. But you can't really have a group of technology alliance of democracies unless you all have similar investment protocols. And getting countries like India, the UK, the United States to agree on what foreign powers can invest in what sectors and how is a very tough. But I think it's a very necessary first step. If we're going to have certain sectors that are dual use, and data-driven technologies are probably AI, quantum, parts of these are extremely dual use, then you need to fence them off from malign investment. So that would be the first step for this, the G7/D10 to begin to develop an internal secure supply chain in those technologies. So I wish it luck.
Thank you. Another question is from Sang Huang from Leeds City Council. Is the Chinese Communist Party exploiting Brexit and the vaccine war between EU and NATO member states to increase its influence along its border to increase its influence in the political sphere in the West? And how is the UK able to defend the principles of democracy in the Commonwealth against the Chinese Communist influence within the organization after Brexit? Lord Ricketts.
Well, that's a complicated question. Part of the answer to it is that, yes, of course, China is trying to use its vaccines as well as its investments as part of competition with the West. I'm afraid, like Russia, China sees all that as quite legitimate, and the idea of vaccines or investment in return for political loyalty and support for China's policies is the kind of policy instrument that China wields. I'm not sure that China is making friends and influencing people with this policy. And I think two of the most interesting policies adopted at the G7 summit, one was to do more for vaccine diplomacy, if I can put it like that, to make sure the West is absolutely in the leading position through COVAX in supplying vaccines to poorer countries as rapidly as possible. The other was, I think, an under kind of reported agreement on this Build Back Better global coalition, the idea really of the West putting out an alternative to China's Belt and Road strategy, which also comes with political strings in terms of unlocking private sector investment into green technology, into infrastructure in poorer countries without political strings, and with as much of the benefits of modern Western technology and investment and finance that we can produce. I think that's a really interesting initiative to show that the West is pushing back against Chinese using as instruments of policy things like vaccine availability and investments. So yes, there are ways the West can push back. Mostly it means by having a more attractive offer and really putting serious resources into it for these countries that are subject of the competition between the West and China.
Victoria, if I could just add to that. I mean, I think where we suffer compared to the Chinese is we don't have a central propaganda department, and we really, in many ways, want one. We're not very good at getting across our message. I mean, if you look at the WHO financing, the UK and incidentally private institutions in the UK gives many times more than the Chinese government does, and in fact no Chinese institutions give other than I think one at a very small subject matter. So we need to be much better at getting the message across about what we actually do for the world. And I don't think it's helped when the government has cut the 0.7% commitment of our GDP to foreign aid and development. I mean, that absolute figure would fall anyway under COVID as our economy has suffered. But I think 0.7, you really shouldn't get rid of that. It's in propaganda terms a very poor move, but in reality terms, it's also a poor move.
Thank you. Dr. Hemmings?
I'm really interested in the second point that Lord Ricketts mentioned, the infrastructure push in the Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific actually really needs infrastructure. Countries have that need, and who can blame China for identifying that need and addressing it? But of course, I think while there's been a lot of pushback on the debt trap diplomacy term, there's definitely still a sort of political leveraging and approach that China is using through its infrastructure builds, and it's pushing very hard, not just on traditional infrastructures and port infrastructures, which are deeply strategic energy, but also on these, forgive me for harkening back to my favorite topic at the moment, digital ecosystems, the smart cities, the way you govern people. And as Charlie was mentioning before, that export of China's model is also being smuggled through those infrastructures. So I'm very keen to see us playing that role, though I understand we shouldn't always just be batting against whatever China's batting. We need to have our own approach, our own philosophy, and not be so responsive and reactive. But anyway, this is where we are for the moment.
Thank you. Another question is from Patrick Loughlane, who is a consultant at Ghost Consulting. And he's referring to comments made a bit earlier today in this discussion. Do you really think that the rule of law is still an appropriate phrase to use when the CCP has rejected the concept? And instead, maybe it would be better to use rule by law to denote how individual rights and legalism are secondary to politics dictated by the party leadership.
So sorry, we didn't hear.
Lord Ricketts. Apologies.
Well, that's a complicated question. I do not think that the concept of the rule of law is outdated because the Chinese Communist Party is impatient with it and is pushing back against it. If that, I think, was the core of the question. I mean, I think in this interconnected world, there is more reason than ever to have some rules of the road, some guidelines for countries to work together. Reference has already been made to digital diplomacy and the Chinese push to influence norms and standards for the next generation of technology, whether it's telecoms or AI or in many other areas. And I think it was interesting that the British Integrated Review contained as one of the new priorities for British diplomacy, regulatory diplomacy. And I think that's absolutely right. I think the Western countries need to be more active in defending and extending the rules-based system that we were largely instrumental in writing to the new frontiers of technology. And the digital one, space is another important area. And we should not leave the ground open for China to remake these rules in their own image. But I think we should not give up. I think China, as a globally interconnected country, needs also a set of rules, even if they are often impatient with them. And we are right to stand up for things like freedom of passage guaranteed under the Law of the Sea Convention. The Chinese find that very uncomfortable, but we are right to push for that. So no, I don't think we should back off that.
Thank you. Mr. Parton.
Well, I think Patrick Lurling's absolutely right in terms of vocabulary. It is definitely not rule of law as we understand it. It's rule by law. The problem comes that, of course, when you read Chinese translations into English, they always use it rule of law, and it gets very confusing when you're writing about these things and sometimes speaking about them, actually to make sure you've got the inverted commas in the right places or that you distinguish between the two. But the party has made the point repeatedly in the last 7 years that it is in control of the law. Xi Jinping says so quite explicitly. The problem comes, of course, when that sort of attitude is transferred to the international arena, as Lord Ricketts has indicated. And in many ways, its behavior in the last few years, the South China Sea is a very obvious example, but so is Hong Kong, and that's, you know, the disregarding of an international treaty lodged at the UN. That's the problem, that the party seems to think that it's still in charge of the law abroad as well. And that point must be continually made and loudly made, despite the pushback and the threats that our countries may then receive from China about, well, we won't invest in you, or we won't trade with you, we won't take your exports, which incidentally, I have a paper coming out on with the council next week, and I think is grossly exaggerated. So forgive me for the plug for that, but I think it's a really important problem, and gross and over sort of, we suffer from it too much because we don't see that those sticks are not as heavy and the carrots are not as juicy as the Chinese and some people in our countries want to portray.
Thank you. And Dr. Hemmings?
May I leap through this and say, extrapolate from how China orders itself and thinks about law, and as Lord Ricketts and Charlie have said, it impacts how they treat treaties, for example, the Joint Declaration or UNCLOS. You see it in that Marxist-Lenin way that law is essentially an output of the powerful, and also, as Xi Jinping, the Tianxia, that law is a product of the emperor figure, that Chinese tradition, which is very at variance with the Greco-Roman, Anglo-German rule of law. That is a global order issue. And I think that's also at the heart of a lot of our issues. How is the global order, how are states going to interact? You know, the unilateral economic punishment, is there no other term of Australia right now for not paying due respect, is a very different type of order than the one we've been used to. So I'm very curious to see where that goes. And I realize we're up against the time, so I'll stop and say thank you.
Thank you very much. It's already 2 p.m. and unfortunately we have to end our discussion. And I would like to sincerely thank all the panelists and the audience. And I do hope that you enjoyed the event. I would also like to remind you that we will be publishing a new paper tomorrow by Dr. Holly Snape from the University of Glasgow, entitled The Chinese Communist Party at 100, Adaptable and Abiding. As well as next week, a new paper will be coming out, written by our Associate Fellow, Charles Parton. So we encourage you to visit our website and to check our latest publications. We have also now kickstarted our events program, and we'll be bringing you many more timely and important discussions on geostrategic challenges and environmental security matters. You can check the upcoming events on our website, and you can subscribe to our events on www.geostrategy.org.uk/subscribe. Thank you very much once again, and see you next time.